Hey everybody, Steve here. Welcome to The Varied Life. And today we're going to talk about something really important, how to practice using manual supports. We're going to be using Lychee Slicer Pro and getting the perfect resin print for your miniatures. Nothing is more frustrating than trying to do manual supports on your models and have them fail or partially fail or have layer shifts and ruining your print and thus wasting the resin and disturbing your comp. So today I'm going to show you the way. I'm going to show you the secret on how to add and practice using manual supports. Now there's a lot of people out on the interwebs that can teach you how to do supports, like this guy here and this guy here and this one and this guy, and they all have some great information. They have some tutorials that are out of this world. But there's a lot of conflicting information as well, like orientation of the print. You'll have somebody that says, okay, well, you need to put it at a 30 degree, and some will say 35, and then a 60 degree angle. No, it needs to be at a 45 or a 50 or a 37.25. Really, it comes down to which one do I do? Just tell me which one that works. Along with some other things, what size of supports do I use? What about the distance between the supports when I'm putting manual supports? How do I know what works? Or is it just a mishmash of trial and error time and time again with tons of frustration until I finally get it? Yeah, I didn't like that. So I looked for the secret and I traveled far and wide, and what I ended up finding is the secret to practicing using manual supports. And here's the secret. It's using pre-supported files as a guide. I mean, what better way to get the perfect print than using a pre-supported file that prints perfectly every time, granted your machine is leveled and all of that stuff. Why don't we use that? Why don't we reverse engineer and look at the rafts that they use, look at the size of the supports that they have, look at the places where they place those supports, the distance between the supports. There's a wealth of information that could be had just by examining pre-supported files. And once I started this, I found this is the missing component for me, and maybe it'll help you become better at doing manual supports. There's actually 4 things that we want to address in kind of examining these pre-supported files. And these are orientation, raft, islands, and supports. So what we're going to actually do is we're going to show you how I go through this process of practicing, and we'll actually do a test to see how it turns out with an actual pre-supported file print that I printed out, and then I'm going to print out some items where I did the supports manually without looking at the model of the pre-supported files, and we'll see how I did. So it's kind of like a final exam, if you will, but doing enough practice by using pre-supported and the unsupported models can help you become a pro at doing manual supports. So let's get started here. What we end up having is Logan. Logan is the man. First, we're going to talk about orientation. How do we orientate the model? And if we look on the pre-supported file here, basically what we can end up doing is looking at that angle of which he sits and conclude, I don't know what that angle is, but it prints out perfect. So what I can end up doing is going with this model here, and I can orientate that in the same manner that we have there. So we're good to go. That answers the question in regards to how do we orientate with a model like this. Now you can do this with miniatures, you can do this with figures or different components that you can print out individual models of items, because often a model will have different parts that you have to put together. The other thing we can end up doing is we zoom into this part here is we can see, again, we want to look at the orientation. We already got that. The second thing we're going to take a look at is the raft. And we see this raft, and that's the line triangle raft that's being used. Now, for some reason, the majority of the files that are pre-supported that I've printed out use the line triangle. So that answers the question of what type of raft should I use. There's other rafts that you can use, and we'll kind of go over that, but let's just use what works and copy that. Makes a lot of sense, especially when you print this out with no problems, right? The other thing we're going to take a look at is islands. We can end up, you could use the slider. So in other words, we could go to prepare, and as we bring the slider down, we can actually see, where those first supports came into play on the back, and kind of get, as we zoom in here, here's some other great information, like what is the distance between these two supports. We can actually go back to the layout, we can get the measurement tool, and we can measure basically between these two, and we can see that it's probably about 2.5 millimeters between those supports, and we can see that distance between. So that tells me, with a successful print like this, that prints out perfect every time, when I do my manual supports, I don't have to have my supports touching each other and having a great wall of supports, because that's going to be a pain in the ass to take off, and I can save a little bit of resin. So we know about 2.5 millimeters is good. Hey, we already gained some very useful information. The other thing we can end up doing is taking a look at, let's swing around here, and we can, if we click on this, some models will not allow you to edit the supports that they have, some models will. But to figure out and say, okay, well, what size of support are we using here? Let's just throw in this support here, and we're using a medium, and we can see that the diameter of this and the diameter of this, they're basically the same. All of these are medium supports. So for this Logan file, what we can end up doing is using all of these are medium supports. So as I do my manual supports on the unsupported file here, I can go ahead and use all mediums, and it will print out perfectly. Now, you will have some people that will say, use the slider and bring it down till you see that area right there on where you should put your first supports. So in other words, we could end up going here, putting our supports here. And that's a workable solution, but Lychee Slicer Pro actually has an island support detector that is invaluable and will do all the hard work for you. So we go back out here and we go to the right side. We have auto supports, we have manual supports, and we have island detector, and of course proximity and some utilities. But the island detector is an awesome tool. There's 4 different settings. You have fast, normal, detailed, and real. And depending on your computer, if you go to real, that could slow down and it will take a little bit of time. But what I've found is by using the detailed search island option, is it will go through this model and it will detect all the islands, and we can use that slider bar, and it will be indicated by red, the color red, as where we can put our supports. And then we could also put some other supports as well. But these supports are going to be very important for supporting the model. So as this finishes up, we end up seeing that there's 176 islands. That's a lot of supports. And basically what we end up seeing, we can see a lot of red up here. We can see a lot of red down here, especially on the back of the arm. And if we look to the model over here, basically we see all of these supports and the supports around this area similar to what we see like on the arm there and on the arm on the unsupported one. So we could go through, and then what we could end up doing, knowing the distance between, we could actually throw in our medium support. And as we go in there, we know that we can put in a little bit of distance. We don't want to do something like this, where that edge is going to cause some damage to the print. And we know that from that other pre-supported model, we could actually back this off and have some distance between, so we can go ahead and put our medium supports. We just run through and we continue on with that. And yeah, this will suffice. And again, I am 100%, is that one hitting a little bit? No? Yeah, it is. It's back that off a little bit. Get it right there. And we can continue building our supports by using that island detector, and we can go through the rest. As we go over here to the arm, we can do the same thing. We can zoom in and we can put our first medium support. And that should be, well, let's go a little bit more. Yep. And then the same thing, we can just again go ahead and put our supports all along this, similar to what we see on that pre-supported file. So we've got that there, and if we look over here, again, we see the similar distances between the supports. And yeah, all we're doing is just copying what we see on the pre-supported file, and we will get a successful print as we continue to go around and put supports on here. Now again, if we look at the file or the slider bar over here, all these indications on red will indicate an island. So as we go up, we can see, okay, we're coming across some more islands, and we see one right here on that elbow. So as we zoom in on this, what we'll end up doing is it's indicated there, bam. As we want to make this a support pillar, you can go ahead and do a vertical support, a support straight, or a support pillar. And then what we can end up doing is kind of addressing all of these things here. Now I have a Mac, so I use Control Option, and I can click on some of these things, and then I go back to the support itself, and it'll put a medium-sized support. And then if I hit the Option Shift, I can replicate that same support all around where I need it. To be able to place these mini supports in this fan, as we see here, and we're able to hit all of these different areas and address all these islands to give the support that this model needs for that elbow, which works really well. Now we're going to speed this up and continue the support in the fan for the elbow and the arm, and we're good to go. So that's what we end up having there. And as we back up, we kind of see the same thing on the pre-supported file. They've got a little fan system. They do a little bit different, but on the front here, we can see that they just have that one support that goes up that supports the elbow. Then they have another one that comes up here, and then their island detector, they ended up doing a little bit more and doing two off to the side here. So again, it's a great way in which we could add supports and get those islands covered. So we can continue on, and you can actually practice and do the entire model. So for example, we go to the back. Before, I would have thought you would need a ton of supports on the back of this figure. And I have done a ton of supports, and it just ended up being a hot mess. But as we zoom in here, what we can end up seeing, and by using the slider, we can see where the very first supports come in, or those first islands, and we can just end up putting our supports in. Let's go ahead and put our supports in there, and we can put in a support there, and then the same thing, we can go ahead and just put these little mini supports in to hit these different areas and give that much needed support. The other thing we could end up doing is we'll select both of these, we'll add some bracings, and voila, that's what we end up having, which is very similar to what we end up having here. So again, we're using the pre-supported file as a guide on how many supports, what type of supports, using fans if they use fans. There's the distance between the supports, we can use that as a guide, and it comes in really helpful. And again, all we're doing is we're copying what works. We're going to be using this little dragon here from Dragon Trapper's Lodge. It's a Spitfire Wyvern dragon, and that's kind of a cool little dragon. It ends up, it's got a base, a body, a couple of wings. This mini is free until March 29th, and because I'm easy, cheap, and free sometimes. And but you might be a little disheartened in the fact that you're like, wow, it's past 29 March. I can't get access to this. Well, there's other free minis that you can get from Dragon Trappers Lodge or any other artist that have pre-supported and unsupported files, and you can do this exact same thing. So what we're going to end up doing is we'll leave that down, and we're going to bring up these files. And here's what we're talking about on the files is we have the supported files for the base, the body, the wing, and then we have the unsupported files. Now, I've done enough practice with the pre-supported files and working with the unsupported files, kind of doing that copy paste, let's use what works thing, and I've done a pretty good job. So we're going to put this to the test, and we're going to take a look at a wing, and we're going to drag that into Lychee Slicer, and we're just going to start, and we're going to do the supports. So there it is. And we're talking about orientation. And when you get enough practice, you'll get to a point of where you can actually say, okay, how are we going to orientate this? Now, there's a couple different ways. Could we print this in this position here? Yeah, but we might get some damage along this side because that's a really smooth edge. And even with the small, medium supports or light supports, yeah, I don't want to do that. So another option that I could end up doing is taking it and putting it on this edge here. Because on the bottom of this, it's really textured and you wouldn't really notice any divots that are caused by the supports. There might be something to this in regards to printing, because how many layers are going to be in this from the bottom to the top? Well, probably about 400 or 500 layers, 600 layers. Whereas if I printed it up and down, that would probably be about 13 or 1400 layers. And again, this is all just experiencing and re-engineering, look at the pre-supported files, and then practicing on the unsupported ones. Now, what I found out is in regards to orientation, a lot comes into play with the shadow. So if I put this in this area, we see a large shadow. And so on this entire face, there would be a lot of supports. To minimize the damage, if I don't want that damage, then obviously I'm going to rotate this to a position and I have a minimal amount of shadow. We don't want a lot of overhang, and we know from doing a number of practice sessions that in this up and down fashion we've got a small shadow, and I think that will work. Now comes the orientation on how do we tilt it. We know that this bottom corner down here is probably where we could end up putting a support, but we also have this little notch here, this nub that sticks out where this wing attaches to the body. What I'm going to do personally is I'm going to rotate this with a little bit of angle, so that way this notch here, or this nub, is the very first island that we see. And then we'll just have a string of medium supports going up along here, and we might have to add some supports up here and maybe up here. But for the most part, that angle looks pretty good. So we're going to go from the layout to prepare. And again, we're going to select the item, and we're going to do the island search. So as we go through this, the slicer program does all the work for you for detecting the islands, and it has 8 islands, which is pretty good. And if we go to the very first one, yep, that is the first one there. And we know by doing a lot of practice that we're going to be using medium supports on this entire thing. So we're just going to go to put one there, boom, that is good to go. I'm not too concerned about the placement of this if there's a little bit of damage, because this end is not going to be seen. It's going to be in a socket, but if you're really kind of anal retentive about it, you could get it to the point of where it's 100%, but that's good enough for government work. So now, that is the very first island. This over here is the second island. So what we can end up doing is adding a support there. That will cover that. And again, we could probably bring this back a little bit so that way yeah, it's not going to cause any noticeable damage. And then all we can end up doing is just kind of going around and continuing putting some supports in here. And that's probably a little bit too much. Let's go ahead and we'll put one here. And to get some of these areas, so for example, I could end up clicking this one. We'll just put a little bit of fan action there to cover that. Click this one, do a little bit of fan action there. And then we can just continue down. You know, we'll put one here, and then we know about the distance, about 2.5 millimeters in between there, and we can just go ahead and do our series of supports along the face of this wing. And I think we'll be good to go. And there it is. That should suffice in regards to what we're going to do. Now we're at the island, the raft. Let's go and we'll make that a line triangle because I just see that as being the one that's used the most. Now this will totally work for the support of this entire wing. They're medium supports. We don't need any additional supports, but if you wanted to practice doing some rafts or some fans, we could go ahead and do that. We could click and do something like that. And I think we're good to go there. The other thing that we can see from our experience of practicing and taking a look at the pre-supported models, we see some bracing. So what I like doing, because I've seen with a lot of models, they will brace supports in groups of 2 or 3. And basically, I think the reason behind that, if we go ahead and go to manual, we'll go down here to bracings, and there's no bracings adding. So what we could end up doing is just kind of clicking here and boom, adding some bracings. And sections of 2 or 3. If they're all clumped together, then it's a little bit harder to take them off and it might cause damage to your print, especially something as small as this wing, which is about a couple inches, 2.5 inches, something like that. So what I'll end up doing is grouping these together and creating little supports or bracings on my own, so that way it's a little bit easier to take off. It gives that rigidity, but again, it's only about 5 millimeters. It's not really necessary. So then we can continue up and we go to the slider and we look for these little red circles or little red indicators to show us the next island. And there is the next island right there. So what we'll end up doing is we'll throw a medium support there. And as we continue on, we can see we can throw a medium support there. And if I wanted to, for supporting this, I could just go ahead and put in a little fan and click on that and just give it a light support. Same thing. Light supports are really, really, really small. Is it absolutely needed? But something that's out at about a 45-degree angle out to the side like that, or however many degrees that is, I think that will work well. It might not be necessary, but it gives you a little bit of practice. We'll select both of those and we'll put in some bracings, and that will help on that aspect. Now what we're going to end up doing is fast forwarding because it's pretty much all the same thing. Just putting supports on the island and we're good to go. And once we finish that up, here is our final result. So with that being said, I would print this out and I am 100% guaranteed that this would print. We would have enough support for supporting the model of this size. Again, it's a miniature model here. And now, what we're going to end up doing is that was the support for the wing. Now the other thing that we could end up doing is realizing that if we do the estimated printing time for this wing, 3 hours and 44 minutes and 43 seconds. Now I know a bunch of you are going to say that's way too long. It should be shorter because it's a small item. I'm using water washable resin and I have more time. I need to tweak my speed settings. But what we could do is that would take 3 hours and 44 minutes. Now let's go back to the layout. Well, let's remove all of these supports, and we'll go back to layout, and we'll put it in this position here. We've got a minimal shadow, and that would print out really good. If we go back to the islands, we'll do a detailed search, and of course probably at that very bottom is going to be the very first one, and then we could do a series of supports along that textured edge, just like we see there, and I think we would be golden. So yeah, you continue on and just do that whole thing until it's similar to like this. Now what this will end up doing is we can minimize the amount of time to print. So if we estimate the printing time now, it's 2 hours and 26 minutes. So we can cut this down in printing time depending on the orientation of the model. So now that we did a little bit of practice, first what we ended up doing is taking a pre-supported file, using that as a guide in regards to the orientation of the model, what types of rafts to use, the island detector with Lychee Slicer Pro on where we put our supports. And then also by that reverse engineering type of thing, we can see whether it was light, medium, or heavy supports that were used, if there was some type of fan action, the density of supports that will result in a successful print. Again, we want to get away from having too many supports that could cause damage to the print, and we definitely don't want, not enough supports so it ruins the print. Now, here comes the point that is really important. What I ended up doing is actually I downloaded that file, and through all the past practice sessions that I've had, I actually supported the wing in this position here and this position here. And these turned out pretty good. And it turned out pretty good. And again, we minimized the amount of time that it took to print that out by having it in that position. And here's the other wing that we ended up doing. And you can see there. And again, it worked out really, really well. So now, what did the pre-supported look like? Well, here's the pre-supported. And we can see, yeah, it is very, very similar. I had a perfect print, and this was a perfect print as well. Here's another wing that we can end up seeing here. It's a perfect print. So you can end up doing a lot of practice. And so, for example, for this base, I know a lot of people have problems with printing bases and keeping that absolute round without any deformation. All we can end up doing is using these pre-supported files to see the density, the type of supports that they use, the placement of the supports, and the distance between the supports so that we can get a successful print. So if you actually look at this here, you can see that there's not much difference between these two supports. So, and they both printed out perfectly. Mine just had a few less supports, as we can see on there. Which one is mine? This one is mine. This one is the pre-supported. And it was a perfect print. And the supports come off because I put them in kind of like groupings of 2 and 3. We don't have any problems taking off these supports. And yeah, I mean, look at that. That turned out pretty good. And we still maintained all of the details. So I am really happy with this. Okay, so there you have it. What we ended up with is the final result of the Mini that we supported, being guided by the example of the pre-supported file in regards to the orientation, the raft that they use, the island detection that Lychee Slicer Pro has, which is an awesome tool. And then of course, where to put the supports, what type of supports, the distance between the supports, and we came out with perfect prints. Okay, so that is the process. The missing link is to use that pre-supported file as a guide in regards to the orientation, the type of rafts that we should use, the island detection that Lychee Slicer Pro has been a godsend. And of course, we can use that pre-supported file to show us the supports that we use to support that model, the distance between them, the size, the whole 9 yards to get those successful prints. So that is going to conclude for the video today. If you learned anything at all, aside from, I know the video was long and I apologize for that. If you learned anything, please give this video a like and consider subscribing to the channel. So with that, I must bid you adieu, and we will see you on the next video. Peace. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to stay up to date with what's going on with us. The Buried Life, as we're retired in Korea. We'll see you on the next video. Peace.